Welcome, everyone. I'm very glad you could join us today. My name is Lynette Roth, and I'm Daimler Curator of the Busch-Reisinger Museum, and I'm head of the Division of Modern and Contemporary Art here at the Harvard Art Museums, and I will be serving as a moderator for our Q&A later on. Before we begin today's program, the Harvard Art Museums acknowledge that Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people, and we at the university strive to honor this relationship. I want to thank you all for joining us this week for our Art Talks Live series, which offer an up-close look at works from our collections with our team of curators, conservators, fellows, and graduate students. And as I know many of you know by now, you can join us on Zoom every other Tuesday at 12:30 p.m. for these short interactive talks. And in these talks, we investigate artist materials and techniques, reveal our latest discoveries, offer a fresh look at old favorites, and explore big ideas using the collections of the Harvard Art Museums. And just a quick few logistics before we begin. We are in the webinar format in Zoom, so you can submit any questions or comments you may have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And you can go ahead and submit those as our presenter is speaking today, but we're not going to get to those questions until the end. And we always try and save at least about 10 minutes to get to your wonderful questions. We will conclude today's talk, though, at about 1 o'clock. So we do try and keep to our time limit. So now I'm very pleased to introduce once again to Art Talks Live, Joachim Homann. Joachim is the Maida and George Abrams Curator of Drawings at the Harvard Art Museums, and really a favorite amongst our audiences for the Art Talks. And I'm very pleased that Joachim today is actually going to be taking us to Cape Cod. And I have to say, I thought it would be kind of funny today to show up wearing a beach hat and drinking a hot or a cold drink for a hot day, but it's actually raining right now in Cambridge. But all the better to join Joachim on a tour of the work of Edward Hopper and the inspiration that the artist gained during his time on the Cape. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joachim, and after Joachim's presentation, we will return for some questions from you. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Lynette. That's a great introduction, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this Art Talk Live from my side. We are going to look at a group of watercolors by Edward Hopper from the Harvard collections that is one of the most distinguished such groups in any museum, and was collected for the most part very early on in Hopper's career too. They all feature Truro on the outer Cape Cod, and if you look at this map from the time around 1930 with me, you see Truro at towards the tip of this extended arm of Cape Cod along the main route that's sneaking up to Provincetown in Massachusetts. As you know, many of you know Cape Cod really well, and some of you might even be zooming in from the Cape. Truro is located between Wellfleet and Provincetown. Still today, it is tucked away between dunes, coves, and lakes, and feels removed from the hustle and bustle of the magnets for summer tourists on the outer Cape. Coincidentally, the 4 watercolors that Edward Hopper created on the Cape are all from Truro and are all dating back to the first time of his engagement with the peninsula, 1930 to 1934. Last week, I visited many sites in Truro that Hopper painted with the expert guidance of Beth Chapman, who's here today as a special guest. Welcome to you, Beth, and thanks for joining us. Beth has done a lot of research into the history of Truro in local archives in conversation with residents and by scrutinizing the Hopper literature. She was able to identify lots of sites, many of which are in her own backyard. Once the museums are open to the public again, we will hear from Beth in detail about the sites in Hopper's day and the transformation they underwent in recent decades. Today, we'll get to know the Harvard watercolors and think about them as a milestone in Hopper's artistic career, as well as the outcome of his first engagement with the Cape, where he and his wife, Josephine, summered starting in 1930 and built a studio and home in 1934. They remained faithful as summer residents to the Cape for the rest of their lives. This program is part of the ongoing research into the American watercolors at Harvard. This effort will culminate in an exhibition in the summer of 2023, 2 years from now, of major watercolors that span about 100 years from the 1880s to the 1990s. It will present works by Winslow Homer, John Singer Sargent, John Marin, Edward Hopper, Romare Beard, and Sol Hewitt, and many others, and coincide with the publication of a splendid catalog that we're working on right now. As it turns out, in the 1920s and 1930s specifically, the Harvard Art Museums were able to acquire many important watercolors from living artists as they reached the zenith of their careers. The purchase of these works was the first sustained engagement with contemporary art by the museum, and it remains an important legacy today. Let me introduce the 4 works that you see on the screen here and say a few words about Edward Hopper's focus on watercolor and his career up to 1930. The earliest work in the group is the stunning watercolor of the iconic Highland Lighthouse, a true landmark. Hopper looks at the lighthouse and the adjacent buildings from the distance and sets them against the bright, windswept summer sky. Several buildings are nestled around the lighthouse, including the keeper's residence and other structures, all painted white. In Hopper's perspective, they are somewhat flattened to form a tight compositional triangle. The lantern almost reaches the top of the large sheet, marking the top of the triangle as well. A burned summer meadow fills the foreground, which seems almost completely empty. It is interrupted only by the sandy driveway towards the lighthouse on the right, and there is a reminder of the vast expanse of open space on land and sea that surrounds these buildings. This work was acquired by Harvard from Hopper's gallery Frank Green in New York in 1930. In Harvard's group, this work is followed by a depiction of a private residence, the Schumann House from 1931. The modest home appears dark against the sun. A young tree is glistening in the bright light. The sheet is dominated by the tight contour of the house, a typical Cape Cod style building in its appearance. If it weren't for the lack of a proper front door, as Beth Chapman pointed out during her tour, all of us in New England are familiar with this building type. It's ubiquitous. I happen to live in a similar center chimney cape myself, and we would expect it to have the formal entrance in the center of the long front that you see here in this picture. We also would know not to use that entrance or only use it for very special guests or festive occasions perhaps, but we would look for a side entrance to the mudroom, if that's not just the main thing. I'm more familiar with the main capes than with Cape Cod capes. The contrast between the bright young tree and the dark house is quite dramatic. When you see the original work, you only get a taste of that here. The watercolor cold storage plan from 1933 has intense saturated colors, a bold composition with an acute perspectival angle, and it is large too. It is, even by Hopper's superlative standards, stunning work. The construction of this image is quite complex too. From an elevated viewpoint, one encounters a red brick industrial building with a tall chimney and a complicated roofline, wedged from the right into a view of dunes, beach, and ocean. In the distance, the tip of the outer cape is visible where Provincetown is located. The left side of the image is barely tightened up by the fragment of a much smaller structure, not more than a sliver of a building actually. The contrast between the red and brown cubic shapes and the open ocean and sky is truly dramatic. How striking then to contrast that work with the fourth watercolor, Another Family Home. By comparison, the Janice House, 1934, is such a relaxed picture. The artist is again elevated, but at this time, quite far removed from the building he focuses on, neatly organized the various parts of this sprawling cape that extend into ever smaller additions, and its diminutive garden fit into a rectangular footprint. Seems to float in a sea of yellow grass. The bleached yellow meadow covers otherwise bare dunes that are only rarely accentuated by shrubs here and there. A farmhouse with barns appears in the distance, equally sheltered by the rolling dunes. The webinar format of the Zoom program makes it hard to have a real conversation, and we are a lot of people today, but I would love to know how you respond to this work. Would you let me know in the chat, and we will revisit that after the talk, which one is your favorite? I would really love to know to what work you respond more strongly. I would love for you to type your answer into the chat. When he worked on watercolors, Hopper had already, on the watercolors from Cape Cod, Hopper had already significant experience with the medium. His familiarity with watercolor dated back to his professional life as an illustrator. His parents had insisted that he trained as a commercial artist, and it was only just at this moment, around 1930, that he finally had the success as a fine artist to stop his commercial work for good. And the financial success that he did enjoy at this point had begun with sales of his etchings with slim earnings, and then the sale of his watercolors developed some momentum. For a long time, Frank Rain Gallery in New York didn't find any takers for any oil paintings by Hopper at all. The one painting Hopper exhibited at the famous Armory show that many of you might have heard about in New York in 1913, a display of European and American modernism that transformed the American art scene. That painting, the one painting that he included in that show, did sell, but it remained the only such sale for the next 10 years. The situation had changed significantly by 1930, however, when he began creating the watercolors we're looking at today, in large part to Josephine Nivison, Joe Hopper, his wife, whom you see sitting with him together in this beautiful summer portrait of the two of them. Joe Nivison was also a painter and had, like Edward, trained with Robert Henry, and they got married in 1924. It was Joe who encouraged her husband to explore watercolor as an artistic medium and to bring his watercolor box with him on the annual vacations to New England, where the Hoppers frequented artist colonies such as Gloucester, Monhegan Island, and others. Two watercolors from the Harvard collection exemplify the first and earlier forays into the practice. So from 1925, just a year after he began his marriage started, they got married in 1924. He followed up on Joe's advice and started doing these watercolors. This is an early one of the Manhattan Bridge. It focuses on a mammoth traffic ramp in lower Manhattan, from which a pylon of the 1909 completed Manhattan Bridge is visible in the distance. On the left side of this work, you see the silhouette of the pylon that carries the suspension bridge, the Manhattan Bridge, in the distance. Even today, it is quite amazing how when you roam in this area of the Lower Bowery in Chinatown, to be confronted with these ramps where the bridges, the Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan Bridge, take off, because they bring such a different scale into this neighborhood. And this is something that Hopper explores with this work, I feel. The second work is only 2 years later, from 1927, also in the Harvard collection, represents another viewpoint, another interest, especially of his travels to New England, where Hopper explored Victorian homes. If he caught a glimpse of the future with the Manhattan side that he portrayed in the earlier watercolor, this was certainly a look into the past. The stately Victorian mansion in Portland, Maine is a monument of a bygone era. The dead tree in front of the house is leaving no doubt that the heyday of this proud building is over. It's still standing today, though. It turned out that Joe's advice was well taken. Edward Hopper loved working in watercolor, and his customers actually loved it too, and his shows in New York City sold out quickly. The Cape Cod watercolors, especially of the Highland Light and the cold storage plant, demonstrate a confidence that's grown out of the earlier successes with the watercolor medium. Photos of the structures around Hopper's time offer insights into his ability to stage buildings to their best advantage. Rather than showing the Highland Light from the path, for example, with which he would have approached it, he sat down on the meadow further to the left, so as to make the Lighthouse Tower quasi grow out of the conglomerate of buildings. You can see how various angles were tried out by the photographers for these postcard views, and Hopper decides on a distinctly different viewpoint, as you can see in Harvard's work on the lower left side of this slide, which offers compositional opportunities that the photographers clearly didn't see. It is indeed tempting to read emotions into Hopper's portrayals of architecture. The protective strength, upright virility, and unblemished whiteness of this and other Hopper lighthouses has, partly encouraged by Joe Hopper's comments, encouraged interpreters to see self-portraits in them. I personally can't believe that Hopper would have wanted the lighthouses to be understood that narrowly. More likely, in my view, is that he found them appealing because they signaled alertness, independence, order in the face of adversity. They also beam a sense of belonging, homecoming, safety. Cold storage plant has a very different appeal. You see the watercolor and historic photos of the site in this slide. This enormous fridge basically held processed fish, especially bait, that was sent out from the adjacent railroad. The building itself almost launches into the sea. It is really built on the beach, and the site is now called Cold Storage Beach, in spite of the fact that the building no longer exists. At a time when the world economic crisis condemned masses of people to inactivity, this watercolor radiated a dynamic environment purely through the composition of geometric elements. All of these works that we discussed today are devoid of any humans, but they are deeply humanistic, at least in my view. They are exploring ways of being, offer encouragement, promise, and a sense of contempt. In reviewing these works again for today's presentation, I was struck by the fact, by the vast spectrum of emotions that Hopper assigns to the buildings in his art, and that indeed moves him ahead of many of his contemporaries. His work represents a reductionism typical of the art of his time, realist or abstract, but this desire for economic means does not curtail, but enhances the expressive forces of his work. Hopper's career really gained traction with the acquisition of his now iconic house by the railroad by the Museum of Modern Art in 1930, the first year Harvard bought Hopper watercolors. After the painting was exhibited in the museum's first exhibition exclusively dedicated to American art, called Paintings by 19 Living Americans. It was one of the first works purchased by the nascent museum. Interestingly, the themes of the two Harvard watercolors that predate the Cape Cod visits from New York and from Maine relate to the subjects of the MoMA painting. There's a Victorian mansion and a street ramp, or maybe even a railway track, just not put together in one almost surrealist image, like in the MoMA painting, which looks a little bit more composed, forcefully composed. But let's go back to the Cape. We have been looking at a lot of houses, and I would like to spend some time thinking about the role of these residential buildings in Hopper's art. Both places, we're looking at the Schumann House and the Janice House again, were in walking distance to the cottage that Joe and Edward Hopper rented for their summer vacation starting in 1930. They enjoyed being in the country so much that they made it a habit to stay almost half a year. For the first time, they came in 1913 and visited South Truro, where their cottage that still exists today was, in Joe Hopper's words, located on the side of a hill in such a wonderful land of bare, green, sandy hills. They adopted the bird cage cottage because there were so many birds and critters coming in and out all the time. The Hoppers fell in love with the light of Cape Cod. Edward Hopper sometimes mentioned that the light in Maine has almost black shadows and that the reflections of the light of the Cape are making contrasts less stark. So this was something where he felt the Cape had an advantage for painters in spite of his love for the state of Maine. The Hoppers also enjoyed the longer seasons for outdoor activities further south. The Schumann House, the newest addition to Harvard's Hopper collection as a bequest from Marnie and Arthur Salomon that just came into the collection earlier this summer, looks somewhat foreboding in the watercolor. From my visit with Beth Chapman the other week, I'm bringing two memories back home and to the appreciation of this watercolor. There was an insane amount of greenhead flies, and these bugs were almost feeling intolerable. Hopper might have worked in his car to be safe from them. This is actually a view of the house from the driveway that still exists today. Hopper is well known to have been working in his car, inside his car. The other memory I'm bringing back from the visit to this house is the beautiful locust tree that you see is still standing and that has such a dramatic appeal of being thrust into the light, into the bright light of the Cape in the watercolor, and it is today enormously bigger, but it is still reaching into the light like it did. I thought it was really fun to see this tree because the light that Hopper captured in his watercolor made the tree grow, and it is still part of its existence today. I love that aspect of it. In 1932, the Hoppers visited Mrs. Janice in Chestnut Hill, outside of Boston. Together, Miss Janice and the Hoppers visited the fog, which is a really nice detail for us to remember. So this was 1932. There are probably not many people who remember that visit anymore. They had just concluded a long road trip to various summer destinations in order to compare real estate markets and make decisions where to buy a summer home. They ended up preferring Truro to Quebec City, to Cape Elizabeth in Maine, and to Gloucester, all sites that they previously visited to check them out. And they bought property for a summer home and studio right next to the Janice's house. In 1934, they were able to move into their unelectrified home that Hopper had designed himself and that was graced with an enormous north-facing window, offered prime studio space for rainy days when he couldn't work outside. For 2 months in the spring of 1934, before the house was ready, the Janice family allowed the Hoppers to stay in their home to oversee the construction of their own building. They also shared the right of way. And for that, Edward Hopper promised them a watercolor of their home, which is the one that then a member of the family donated to Harvard much later on. And that's the watercolor you see on the lower left. So the first engagement with this house is the one on the upper right, and the second one, the later one that's now at Harvard, is the one on the lower left. Is it fair to say that the first watercolor of the Janice house reflects the friendship with the family as it describes their home as open, welcoming, and accessible? And the second watercolor celebrates the Hoppers' arrival in the neighborhood. While it doesn't show the Janice's proximity to the Hoppers outright. It is seen from the direction of the new house. So when, Edward Hopper would have been on his own property looking down, as far as I understand, onto the Janice's home. And by showing a second home in the distance of his second watercolor that you see here, the neighborly relations of this beautiful corner of the world are evoked. Hopper did never paint the outside of either the rental cottage where he stayed, nor the home he designed and had built. These must have been interior spaces for him from where to experience the world around him. But this is as close as he got. Before we conclude this program, I would like to point out that Western art has a long history of depicting homes and urban environments. And Hopper, of course, needs to be seen in that tradition. When Hopper's critics celebrated his fresh vision of the American scene, they took for granted that these works were only recognizable as art because of long European antecedents to his production. I mean, I'm the drawings curator of the Harvard collection, and I can't help but show you some unbelievably special old master drawings. Just for a second, we will go back to Hopper in a moment. Take, for example, these two drawings from the Harvard collection. Abraham Blumart's incomparable study of a storied farmhouse is every bit as suggestive as a Hopper house, and it is 400 years older. Gainsborough's sketch at the bottom shows a modest home nestled between the trees. It is as inviting and full of character as any 20th century rendering of such themes as well. Hopper himself pointed out that his stays in Paris before World War I were crucial for his artistic development. The mid-19th century printmaker Charles Mérion and the early 20th century French photographer Eugène Atget were certainly on his mind as he developed his own perspective on New York City and created a visual rhetoric that he also applied later to the countrysides that he was interested in. Closer to home were the Americans, which provided avenues for exploration. Robert Henry, Edward and Joseph Hopper's teacher, inspired generations of students to dedicate themselves to contemporary America. The painter John Sloan is just one example of several who were doing just that. And there is Martin Lewis, the printmaker who taught Edward Hopper etching techniques and is very, very accomplished, and developed a magical realism, often of night scenes that left their mark, underexplored, yet I think in Hopper's subject matter as well. And then there was, of course, Charles Birchfield, and we should be dedicating one of these programs to Birchfield because he's really fabulous. His watercolor of an old farmhouse helps to understand Hopper's particular interest in the built environment. Hopper himself wrote an important essay on Birchfield, who was a personal friend, and occasionally he was even chastised by critics like Nathaniel Pusset Dart for being too much under Birchfield's influence. Hopper always rejected that claim. When you look at this particular watercolor, and I apologize for the distorted snapshot photo, it's not quite the actual image is, of course, straight. It's only the house that's crooked. It's a little bit misleading, this photo. When you look at the watercolor, you actually see a grotesque face in the building's facade. Do you see that when you focus on the main entrance and you look at the narrow windows just under the roof line, and you realize that they're actually angry eyes? It almost looks like a witch's face or something scary like that. It would have been worthy of a Walt Disney, but Edward Hopper stayed away from such effects that were too obvious, I think, for him. Birchfield clearly is someone who is very close to Hopper. And when you read Lloyd Goodrich's early work on Hopper catalogs, even in the 1970s, he quotes extensively Hopper's writings on Birchfield and applies them to Hopper's own work. An artist who has recently been championed by the eminent art historian Alexander Nemiroff is George Auld. Auld is maybe lesser known, but he's an absolutely wonderful artist. I really love his work from the 30s and 40s. And I need to point out here that already years before Hopper arrived on the Cape, Alt had painted, and you see that on the lower left, the cold storage plant, this one in Provincetown, painted in 1921. And he even painted the year before Hopper arrived, the same lighthouse, the Highland Light, from a very different perspective to very different ends. You see that on the right. It's with Peter Nisbet at the Eckland Museum at North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So Hopper might not be quite the solitary figure art historically and in his personal life that many commentators want us to believe he was. There is still more to do to place him within the cohort of painters that defined the realist art of his time. The group of watercolors in the Harvard collection provides a wonderful starting point for such investigations. In the preparation of this talk, I read two things that suddenly made me think about Hopper in new ways, and I want to share them with you just as snapshots at the end of this talk. The first one is the quote from Goethe that Hopper carried in his wallet for much of his adult life, according to his biographers. It describes the resonance between macrocosmos, the world around us, and microcosmos, the world in us. And Goethe proposes here that art is a device to bring the two into a harmony. It's a very optimistic interpretation of the faculties of art, to be sure, but it is one certainly worth considering further in relation to Hopper's paintings and watercolors. The beginning, he writes, the beginning and end of all literary activity is the reproduction of the world that surrounds me by means of the world that is in me, all things being grasped, related, recreated, molded, and reconstructed in a personal form and original manner. Now, the second inspiration that I found insightful when it comes to Edward Hopper's Cape Cod works, it's the cartoon from this week's New Yorker. Sometimes I just need a weekend away from the city to marvel at all the available property. You know that we all are at a moment where people like to leave the cities and they like to move into the country, at least for weekends and vacations. Here we are again. Hopper and Edward and Joe Hopper, of course, did the same thing already in 1930. I think we understand Hopper's Cape Cod watercolors best when we take both levels of his engagement with the world into account, idealism as well as capitalism. I just want to conclude this talk by thanking Beth Chapman for a wonderful tour of the Cape on tracing Edward Hopper's footsteps. And I would like to share with you these really seminal works, introductory works on Hopper's biography by Gail Levin, the former Whitney curator, and by Lloyd Goodrich, a close ally of Hopper's, who was the Whitney director up to the 1970s. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joachim. Would you actually mind going back to your slide of the 4 choices that you gave everyone for their vote of their favorite Hopper Cape Cod watercolor from the
Of
collection?
course.
We had quite a response, and I did a very unscientific tally. So it is clear that the Highland Light is the forerunner amongst our audience today, with the cold storage plant being a close second, but all 4 of the watercolors got praise from various participants. Some couldn't decide. Some people were casting 2 votes, and I know, Joachim, that you will have a lot of fun reading the various comments about why everyone made those choices. But I'll add my vote also for Highland Light today. And in fact, it was wonderful to see how many of our audience participants actually said, well, today this one's my favorite, right? And I think that's also something that came across so wonderfully in your descriptions of Hopper. His changing view and how he was responding to not just the Cape and its architecture, but also to the weather and the light and all those things. So because we are a little bit short on time, I'm very glad you actually answered a lot of our questions already, many of which had to do with Hopper's influences, and you covered that very beautifully. So thank you. We did have a couple of questions about the whether or not he painted plein air. And I know you mentioned the green had flies and that he was confined to his car, which I can relate to. Maybe you could just say a few more words about how the process took place when Hopper was making his watercolors.
That's right. So Hopper is known to have made many sketches when he was out and about. And I guess I should even start earlier. There is some reason to believe that it was actually Joe Hopper who was really good in spotting locations, and that she would make suggestions where he could try out finding a motif. And the two of them often painted side by side, often both of them in the car. I mean, sometimes I imagine that Edward Hopper created some of the many sketches that are now at the Whitney Museum and that quickly jot down possible compositions and strengthen his vision before he then sets out and lays down a very faint drawing on the watercolor. And then he was very adamant to add glazes of watercolor that hardly ever, if ever, contained any traces of gouache or body color. They were always very translucent, and that gives the watercolors this really fantastic glow that they have preserved in many cases. So yes, my understanding is that a large part of the watercolors was actually done outside, and he did create works sometimes from the porch, screened in or covered porch of his cottage when he would look outside on the landscape around him, or from the car, but he often would also be truly a plein air painter.
Thank you. Yes, Beth Chapman mentioned in the chat that the original chimney is still apparent on the Schumann house, but that Hopper changed all the fat chimneys he painted in Truro into skinny chimneys to accomplish the vertical lines he favored. So I thought perhaps you could comment on that.
But it is really fascinating to visit the sites with Beth, and I hope that more of us have that opportunity. I'm looking forward to talking more about these things when we meet at the museum, once we are open again. It is very clear that Hopper not only meant to show a faithful representation of a particular site, but that he chose the sites because he associated a particular expression with it. And in order to convey what he wanted to convey, he definitely sharpened angles and extended architectural features. The presence that these structures develop on the sheet of paper in Hopper's representation is absolutely stunning. I mean, all of these qualify to be kind of called iconic. They're really transformed into strong images. And the strange thing is, when you see them in person, they're not always really living up to the expectations. You realize that it is the artist's vision that makes them so compelling.
Well, thank you so much, Joachim. And I know that everyone appreciated the talk today. And as always, there's so much more to discover. And we look forward very much to the watercolor exhibition and to hearing much more about the medium and about the collections from you in the years to come, obviously. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and also mention that we do have an Art Studies Center seminar coming up this Friday at 11 o'clock with George Abrams, a collector of drawings and a major supporter of the museums. And so I encourage you all to reserve a spot for that on Friday and to stay tuned. We don't have all of our calendar listings up just yet for the rest of the summer, but our Talks Live will continue throughout July and August. So please check our website for those mentions, and remember Tuesdays at 12:30, and we'll see you there. So thank you again, Joachim, and thanks to everyone for this fantastic presentation and for the wonderful questions.